Welcome back. However your day went, however long you've been waiting for something to change, you can rest that down here, just for tonight. Tonight's story is about a young man who did everything right, and for a very long time it didn't seem to matter at all. He was faithful in the smallest of rooms, faithful in the deepest of forgettings, long before anyone ever called him great. If you have ever wondered whether your quiet faithfulness even counts, if no one seems to notice, if nothing seems to change, if the waiting has gone on so much longer than you thought it would, this story has been waiting for a listener exactly like you. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm. You don't have to manage it, just let it happen underneath everything else. Let the mattress hold your whole weight. Whatever you were carrying when you pressed play, you can set it down at the door of this story and pick it back up tomorrow, if you still even want it. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight but here. Somewhere far from here, further than miles can measure, there is a night much older than this one. A sky so thick with stars it looks spilled rather than scattered. Hills the color of bread crust, cooling now that the sun has gone down behind them. Picture a well-worn road, pale in the moonlight, winding between hills where sheep are already folded in for the night. Somewhere out there, a shepherd's fire is burning low, just embers now, throwing almost no light at all, and the person tending it is listening to the particular silence that only exists this far from any town. No voices, no footsteps, just wind moving through grass that's already gone cool and gray in the dark. A family's flocks have been grazing for days out here, far from home, far from their father's watching eye. It's in a valley like this one, ordinary, dusty, unremarkable, that tonight's story begins. Not with a king, not with a battle, just a boy of 17, walking out to check on his brothers, wearing a coat his father loved him enough to make specially for him. He didn't know, as he walked, that this ordinary afternoon would be the last one of his old life. Let that stillness settle over you now, the dust, the heat easing into evening, the particular quiet of a story that hasn't decided yet what kind of story it's going to be. Stay with me. I'll go slowly. His brothers had never loved him easily, and there's no use softening a fact this old. He was born to his father's favorite wife, and favored so plainly that even a child could see it. The coat he wore, dyed in colors the other coats didn't have, was proof enough of where he stood in his father's heart. Favorites are rarely comfortable to stand beside. Over years, not moments, something in his brothers hardened toward him. Small slights, cold silences, a distance that grew wider every season, until by the time he was 17, they could barely speak to him kindly at all. It hadn't always been only the coat. Joseph had a way of talking about dreams he'd had, strange, vivid dreams where sheaves of wheat in a field bowed low to his own sheaf, where the sun and moon and 11 stars all bowed down to him, as if the whole family, the whole sky, somehow answered to him. He was young enough, and maybe unguarded enough, to say these things out loud at the dinner table, not understanding yet how they would land. His brothers heard them as exactly what a spoiled favorite would say about himself, and it didn't help matters at all that even their father, listening, grew quiet and thoughtful rather than simply laughing it off. So by the time that ordinary afternoon arrived, the resentment already had months, maybe years, of quiet feeding behind it. Then came the ordinary afternoon that stopped being ordinary. Jacob sent his favored son out to the fields where his brothers were pasturing the flocks, just to see how they fared and bring back word. Joseph walked out across the hills in that coat, in the early light, with no idea at all that this walk would be the last thing his old life ever asked of him. I won't dwell long on what happened next, because you don't need every hard detail to understand the shape of it, only enough to understand what he carried afterward. There was a pit, dry and rough-walled. There was a caravan of traders passing by, bound for Egypt with their camels and their goods. And there was a decision made quickly. The kind of decision brothers make only after they've stopped looking at each other as brothers at all. By evening, Joseph was walking south in chains among strangers, and his brothers were already rehearsing the story they would tell their father. Something about a wild animal, and a coat torn and stained, and a grief they knew would be real, even though the story wrapped around it wasn't. 17 years old, and everything he had ever known, his father's voice, his own bed, the particular color of the hills he'd grown up beneath, all of it sold for the price of a stranger's convenience. But this, even this, was not the end of his story. Egypt swallowed him the way deserts swallow rivers, slowly, completely, without apology or explanation. He was sold again once he arrived, this time to a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's own guard. And if you had told the boy walking into that unfamiliar courtyard what the coming years held, he might not have believed a word of it. Because Joseph did not let Egypt make him bitter. Somewhere in that long walk south, in the loneliness of belonging to no one, he made a decision that nobody saw him make. He would be faithful anyway. Not because anyone was watching, not because faithfulness had done him any good yet, simply because it was who he was, underneath everything, and slavery hadn't managed to reach that part of him. So he learned the household. He learned the names of the servants, the rhythms of the kitchen, the particular way Potiphar liked his accounts kept. Quietly, patiently, without an audience, Joseph did the small, unglamorous work in front of him as well as it could possibly be done. And slowly, the way trust always grows slowly, people began to notice. Potiphar noticed first. He gave Joseph more to oversee, and then more again, until eventually the entire household ran smoothly through this young foreigner's steady hands, and Potiphar himself stopped worrying about anything except what he wanted for his next meal. Mornings there began the same way most mornings do in a large household. Grain to be measured, accounts checked against the harvest already stored, servants coming to him with small disputes he learned to settle fairly, without favoring anyone simply because they'd asked him first. He walked the storerooms himself, counting jars by lamplight before the house woke, because he'd rather know a shortage existed than be surprised by one later. None of it was glamorous work. All of it mattered, and he did it as if someone important were watching, even on the mornings when he was certain no one was. For a real while, long enough that Joseph might have let himself believe it was safe now, things were good. Almost. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph too, but not in any way that would lead somewhere good. Day after day she pressed him toward something he would not do, and it wasn't naivete that made him refuse her, or fear of being caught. There was simply a line inside him that 13 years of loss and slavery and loneliness had never once managed to move. "There is a line I will not cross," he told her, quietly, without cruelty, more than once. "Not even here. Not even now. Not even for you. I answer to more than what happens inside this house." She did not forgive him for that refusal. One day, when the house had emptied out enough for her purposes, she caught hold of his cloak, and when he pulled free rather than stay, leaving the cloak behind in her hand, she turned that cloak into evidence and told a story about him to the household, and later to her husband, that was not true. I won't linger on the details of the accusation, because they matter far less than this does. Joseph had done nothing wrong. Nothing. He had been faithful in the smallest of things, faithful when no one would ever have known if he stopped, and none of that faithfulness saved him. Potiphar believed his wife, as perhaps in that house he had to, and Joseph, who had climbed through nothing but patient integrity from slave to the most trusted man in the household, was led away to the king's prison as if none of those years had ever happened at all. He didn't shout. He didn't fight the men who led him away. What was there to say, really, that would have changed anything in that moment? He simply walked, the same steady way he'd walked into that house years before as a slave with nothing, watching the household he'd built with his own 2 hands grow smaller behind him. Isn't that the part that stings hardest when you sit with it? Not simply suffering for the very thing you did right. But even this was not the end of his story. The prison was cool stone and long shadows, floors that stayed cold even at midday, a narrow window set too high in the wall to reach, letting in a single, changing patch of light that told the only reliable time in that whole place. Time moved strangely there, slower on some days than others, and never quite the way a person outside would expect. Joseph could have let something in him go hard in that room. Plenty of men did, in rooms like that one. Instead, with no audience left to perform his integrity for, with no one watching who could reward him for it, he simply kept being who he already was. Faithful in a locked room. Faithful with the door shut. Faithful with nothing at all to show for it, and no promise that anything ever would come of it. Slowly, the keeper of the prison began to notice him too. The way people always eventually notice steadiness, even when they aren't looking for it. Joseph was given more responsibility. Other prisoners were placed under his care, and he kept order among them without cruelty, kept whatever records needed keeping without complaint. And somewhere in all those unremarkable, unrewarded days, that stone prison became, strangely, a place where he was needed. There was an older prisoner there, a man who'd once worked the royal quarries and lost his footing, literally, an accident, nothing more dramatic than that, and ended up owing a debt he'd never managed to repay from inside a cell. Joseph brought him his portion of bread each evening without being asked to, and sat with him sometimes in the particular quiet that settles between 2 people who've both run out of reasons to explain themselves to anyone. Neither of them talked much about hope. It felt safer that way, most days. But Joseph kept doing the small things anyway. The bread, the sitting, the fair word to the guards on the older man's behalf. The way a person keeps watering a garden, even in a season when nothing seems to be growing, just in case something, someday, still might. Seasons turned outside that high window, though he could only guess at them from the color and slant of the light. Some mornings it fell pale and thin, a winter light. Some evenings it turned the whole cell the color of honey for a few minutes, before disappearing entirely. And he learned to watch for that hour the way other men might watch for a letter that never came. Winter came once, then twice, then a third time. He could tell by the particular chill that settled into the stone floor and refused to leave until well past what should have been spring. Summer came between them, turning the light through that high window a fierce, dry gold by midday, so bright for those few hours that he'd have to look away from it. He marked time by weather because there was nothing else reliable to mark it by. No calendar, no visitors, just the slow, patient turning of one ordinary season into the next, and his own ordinary faithfulness turning right alongside it. Then, one stretch of days, 2 new prisoners arrived, a cupbearer and a baker, both men who had served in Pharaoh's own house, both fallen suddenly from favor for reasons Joseph never thought to ask about. One morning he found the 2 of them troubled, their faces heavy in a way that had nothing to do with prison food or prison walls. "Why do you both look so sad today?" he asked them gently. "We each had a dream last night," they told him, "and there's no one here to explain what any of it means." "Interpretations aren't really mine to give," Joseph told them. "But tell me what you saw, and let's see what can be understood together." So they told him. The cupbearer described a vine with 3 branches, budding, blossoming, ripening all in what felt like a single breath, into grapes he pressed by hand into Pharaoh's own cup. Joseph listened carefully, turning the dream over, and then told him plainly, in 3 days, Pharaoh would lift his head and restore him to his former place, cup in hand once more. "If it goes well for you," Joseph said, and there was something almost hesitant in how he asked it, "would you speak my name to Pharaoh? Just once. I don't belong here, not because I'm owed anything, but because none of what they said about me was ever true." The baker's dream carried a harder answer, and Joseph gave it to him as gently as truth allows, because some truths cannot be softened past a certain point without becoming something else entirely, a kindness that isn't actually kind. 3 days later, everything unfolded exactly as Joseph had said it would. The cupbearer was lifted up and restored to his place at Pharaoh's table, cup in hand, exactly as before. And he forgot. Not out of cruelty, just the ordinary, careless forgetting of a man returned to comfort, whose mind quickly filled back up with better things to hold on to than a stranger left behind in a cell. Joseph had asked, gently, to be remembered. He simply wasn't. One more day passed, then another. A season turned outside that high window. Another season came in behind it. 2 full years, the story tells us. 2 whole years of that same narrow light, that same cool stone, that same faithful, unrewarded, unremembered patience, with no way of knowing whether it would ever end at all. If you have ever done the right thing, and then waited, and waited, for a door that never opened, a phone that never rang, a promise someone else quietly let themselves forget, you already know, in your body, exactly what those 2 years must have felt like from the inside. I won't pretend the waiting didn't hurt him. It must have. He wasn't made of the same stone as the walls around him, whatever they might have looked like from the outside. There must have been nights in that cell when hope felt like something other people got to have, and he simply didn't. But hurting and being forgotten are not proof that you've been abandoned. Sometimes they're only proof that the story isn't finished yet. And even this long, forgotten, unfair silence was not the end of his story. Because doors that stay shut for years can still swing open in a single ordinary morning. And that morning came. It began, of all places, with Pharaoh himself. He began to dream, strange, insistent dreams that returned twice in one night and refused to loosen their grip by daylight. 7 fat, healthy cattle grazing by the river, and then 7 starved, wretched cattle rising up out of the same water and swallowing the fat ones whole, without growing any less thin themselves. 7 full, golden heads of grain on a single stalk, and then 7 thin ones, scorched by the east wind, devouring the full ones just as completely. Pharaoh woke shaken both times, and called for every wise man and magician in Egypt, and not one of them could tell him what any of it meant. And then, finally, after 2 long years, something stirred loose in the cupbearer's memory. "I remember my faults today," he admitted to Pharaoh, the words coming slow and a little ashamed of themselves. "There was a young Hebrew man in the prison once, a servant to the captain of the guard, who interpreted a dream for me and for the baker beside me, and it happened exactly as he said it would." So they sent for Joseph. Picture that moment for just a breath, the guards arriving at his cell without warning, after 2 full years of nothing changing at all. He hadn't done anything to make this moment happen. He couldn't have. All he had done, in all that time, was keep being faithful in a room where no one seemed to be watching, for far longer than felt fair to anyone. They shaved him. They dressed him in clean linen. And Joseph, a foreigner, a slave by every record that mattered, a prisoner with no legal claim to stand anywhere near a throne, was brought, blinking into the light, before the most powerful man in the known world. The throne room was nothing like the prison. Painted pillars rose higher than he could comfortably look up at without tipping his head all the way back, the way he used to tip it back toward that one high window. Courtiers lined the walls in linen so fine it seemed to catch the light on its own. And at the center of it, on a raised seat gleaming with gold, sat the man whose single word had built and ended 1,000 lives that year alone. Joseph had spent 2 years being forgotten in a room the size of this one's shadow. Now every eye in the room was on him at once. "I have heard," Pharaoh said, studying him, "that when you hear a dream, you can explain it." "That part isn't mine to claim," Joseph answered, "and there is something worth sitting with in that answer, even now." Standing in front of a king who could end his life with a single word, he still gave the credit away from himself. "But God will give you what you need to hear." And Joseph told him plainly. 7 years of great abundance were coming to all the land of Egypt, more grain than anyone alive had ever seen. And directly behind those years, 7 years of famine so complete that the abundance before it would be entirely forgotten, unless someone wise was placed in charge of storing grain now, while there was still grain worth storing. He said it plainly, without dressing it up, the way a person speaks when they've stopped needing anyone to be impressed by them. Store now, in the good years, so the famine doesn't undo everyone when it comes. Simple, almost obvious, once someone finally said it out loud. Pharaoh looked for a long moment at this foreign-born former slave, this quiet man who had just walked in from a prison cell, and said the words that changed everything that came after. "There's no one else like you in this entire kingdom. From this morning on, my household answers to you. My people will follow your word. The only person who outranks you now is me." That same afternoon they placed Pharaoh's own signet ring on Joseph's hand, dressed him in fine linen, and hung a gold chain around his neck. He rode out through the streets of Egypt in the second royal chariot, and people bowed low as he passed. The same young man who had once been thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold like property to strangers, falsely accused in a house that should have protected him, and quietly, completely forgotten for 2 long years in a stone room with a window too high to reach. Everything that had happened to him, every unfair moment, every locked door, every single year that must have felt entirely wasted while he was living through it, none of it had been wasted after all. It had simply been shaping him, in the dark, for a morning he couldn't have possibly seen coming. It had not been the end of his story. It rarely is. Not while you're still breathing, still faithful, still here. Maybe your prison isn't made of stone. Maybe it's a diagnosis nobody has fully explained yet, or a job you do faithfully every day while somebody else gets the credit. Or a marriage you've kept showing up for while wondering if anyone notices the showing up at all. Maybe it's a promise someone made you, quietly, that they seem to have forgotten completely, the way the cupbearer forgot, not out of malice, just out of the easy forgetting that comes when your own life gets comfortable again. Whatever your version is, I want you to hear something clearly, here, in the dark, where it's safe to actually hear it. Your faithfulness in that unglamorous room is not wasted, even when it feels invisible, even when no one is measuring it, even when the reward you were hoping for keeps not arriving. Joseph didn't know, in that cell, that a king's dream was coming. He didn't know any of it. He just kept being who he was, in the smallest of duties, because that's who he'd decided to be a long time before anyone was watching. That's the part of this story I want to leave with you tonight. Not the ending with the chariot and the gold chain, though that part is true too. The part underneath it, that the 2 forgotten years counted. They weren't wasted time before the real story started. They were the real story. They were exactly where his character was being formed into something strong enough to hold what came next. I think sometimes we assume that if we're truly on the right path, we'll be able to feel it working. some sense of forward motion, some small sign along the way. But Joseph had no such signs. 2 years of silence gave him nothing to measure his faithfulness against except his own quiet decision to keep offering it. Maybe that's actually the harder, truer kind of faith. Not the kind that feels confirmed at every step, but the kind that keeps showing up anyway, in a room with no window to the future at all. So if you are in a season of doing everything right and still waiting, still faithful in a room that doesn't seem to know you're there, this isn't a detour from your story. It might be the very chapter that's quietly preparing you for whatever comes after it, in ways you won't be able to see until you're finally standing on the other side of it, looking back. This isn't the end. It rarely is, for people who keep being faithful in the dark. Let this be the last thing your mind holds on to tonight. Whatever room you're waiting in right now, however long you've been faithful in it, however unnoticed it's felt, it is not wasted, and it is not forever. May you rest tonight the way Joseph must have finally rested once the waiting was over. Safe, seen, and completely at peace, with nothing left to prove to anyone. May the parts of you that have been quietly faithful for a long time now, without applause, without proof it mattered, feel a little less alone tonight, knowing this story was written down all those centuries ago and kept, just for you, just for tonight. You are not forgotten. Not by this story, not by the one who sees every quiet, unrewarded, faithful day, even the ones nobody else will ever know about. Let your body sink a little heavier into the bed now. Let your thoughts get quieter and slower, the way a candle gets quieter just before it finally, gently goes out. Rest now. The waiting is doing its work, even while you sleep. Good night.